Hello everybody, I'm John, this is JP Strategic Investments, and today we're going to go over the operational exercise report from NCS4 on Patriot One Technologies' MSG platform. Now, if you're a Patriot One shareholder, you know we've been waiting on this report for a while. It is a very detailed report, 61 pages long, so we can see why it took so long. They did a really good job, really thorough analysis here. And we're going to go over the report in detail, exactly how the operational exercise was set up, what the score was, what the scores mean. I've even got an Excel spreadsheet for you guys to kind of break it down even further. And so without further ado, let's just jump right in and I'll share my screen here. The first thing that I want to go over here is this scoring system, okay? So when they did the report here, basically there were two different tests. There was a test with the version 1.1 of the MSG platform, and then about a month later, a little less than a month later, there was another test with version 1.4 at a different location. The first test was a climate pledge. The next test was at, I believe, like a hotel conference center or something like that. Now, as we've gone over before, basically the way that these operational exercises are done by NCS4 is the vendor, in this case Patriot One, gives NCS4 the requirements or the standards that they believe that their product meets, and NCS4 then tests the product against those standards. In this case though, what it seems that Patriot One has done, and I mentioned this in my last video, is it looks like they're trying to get the test standards in this case as close as possible to what their customers are going to be looking for. When we're talking about professional sports, casinos, live entertainment arenas, different things like that. They want NCS4 to kind of test it to those standards so that they can then use this test, go show their customers, hey, we meet your standards. Our product is a great fit for your venue. And so when we look at this report here, there are kind of two ways that the product is scored. There is kind of some raw numbers as far as percentages in relation to what the requirement was and what the actual outcome of the test was. But then there's also this rating scale that they're using here. So you can see here that they have a 0 to 3 scale. And 0 is the product does not meet the stated requirement. 1 is that it partially meets the requirement. But then 2 and 3 are kind of weird here because 2 and 3 both say that they meet the stated requirement. 2, although, has recommendations attached to it. Now, when I first read this, it seemed to me like, okay, well, 2 is probably you pretty much met the standards, but you need to do a few more things. And 3 is you met the standard, you're good, right? But it seems that that's not quite the case, or at least that's not the way that some of the evaluators actually interpreted that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the video. One last thing though, before we get into the actual scores of the report that I do want to touch on is this diagram here where it shows the locations that they placed objects during the testing process. So they actually used 9 separate locations. Looks like we have basically one at around the head, like if somebody had something in their hat or something like that. We have the shoulders, pockets, kind of center of body, in the groin area, and then at the ankles with 8 and 9. So a variety of different testing locations that they placed different objects. It looks like each object was tested multiple times at each location, so very thorough process here. And they go over some of the different locations in the scoring report, so I wanted you guys to see this so you have this as a reference. And you can, always go back, pause the video, or if you open up the link to the report in the description so that you can have that kind of side by side while we're going over this here. And as far as the actual objects that were tested here, we have some pictures here, a variety of knives, anywhere from less than 4 inches all the way to over 6 inches. So that was kind of the categories that they used. And then we have a variety of different handguns here and test guns, things like that. Okay, so these are some of the items. Oh, and then these are, what they call innocuous items. So these are the things that the system is meant to ignore, right? We don't want these to show up. We don't want these to alert when people are walking through. That's kind of Patriot One's whole value proposition here, is that it doesn't detect these. You can just walk right through, and it differentiates between these and the weapons, right? So these are some different, phones, keys, wallets, belt buckles, etc. Right? And so now I want to get into the actual report itself. This is kind of just some math here. Basically, they're saying how they got the average score and everything like that. But if we get into the test here, and I want to show you guys, this is where the actual score, and as far as the raw numbers, the percentage in relation to the requirement and the outcome, is slightly different than the 0 to 3 scale score, and you have to kind of do some differentiating here. So what I mean by that is what we have here on the left is what was being tested, right? So first category we have is ferrous metal detection. So we're talking basically knives and guns, aside from, ceramic knives or guns, or 3D printed plastic guns, things like that. This is basically your generic standard handguns and knives. They have over here handgun. This is basically the handgun test object that we've seen multiple times that replicates a real gun. On the right here, the requirement is the system will detect a handgun, and they say the NIJ large test object, at a rate of greater than 98%. The outcome of the test in this case, total rate at 9 test locations, was 89%. So in this case, they actually didn't meet that standard, which is not a good thing, obviously, but we'll get into the next test and we can actually see some pretty good improvement there. And that, to me, was one of the most impressive things about this entire report. But what I want to touch on here is they give some evaluator feedback, right? In this case, they say that while 7 test locations had nearly 100% detection rate, 2 test locations were slightly above 50%, right? So 2 test locations didn't do very well at all. And if we look in the notes of the report later on, we know that those 2 test locations were the ankles, right? That was test location 8 and 9, I believe, on that little diagram there. So the nice thing here about the evaluator feedback is Patriot 1 can go and say, okay, well, what we need to work on is the ankles. And in this case, the 1.2, I think, is very fitting, right? Because it shows, hey, 1, you didn't meet the requirement, you partially maybe met it, right? But there are 2 locations where you really need to work on, right? Where this 0 to 3 scoring scale doesn't necessarily make sense to me is an example on the second one here. So here we have knives with blades greater than 6 inches. The requirement is that the system will detect knives larger than 6 inches at a rate of 80% or greater. Well, the outcome was that the total rate at 9 test locations was 96%. So they more than met, they exceeded the 80% or greater requirement, right? So to me, that should be automatic 3, right? You did even better than what the standard was. But there was some feedback here, and it says, although the system exceeded percentage threshold, misses were observed in the same 2 test locations experiencing lower detection rates outlined in functional area 1.1, which was the one that we just read about handguns. Well, okay, I get that. And it's nice to have that feedback that those same 2 test locations is what you need to work on. But if we're talking about this specific requirement where the system must detect knives larger than 6 inches at a rate of 80% or greater, the system did that. In fact, it did more than that. So to me, taking points away because you just want to add that little feedback there, that feedback is valuable, but it shouldn't necessarily count against them in this 0 to 3 scoring system, in my opinion. And there's another example of that if we look down here with cell phones, for example, okay? In this case, right, the system does not want to detect cell phones. So the requirement is that the system will alert to cell phones at a rate of 10% or less, right? We don't want detection on these cell phones. Well, the outcome was that the total rate was 8% for items used during this exercise. So 8%, obviously lower than 10%. Perfect, right? Should be a 3. Well, they had a note here that says, although the detection rate was below the identified threshold, larger phones caused the largest percentage of detection, right? I mean, again, valuable feedback, right? Okay, well, we need to work on these large phones. But if we're talking about whether it met the requirement, in this case, it exceeded the requirement or met the requirement, right? Because it was less than 10, I don't see why that shouldn't be a 3 there. And there are multiple examples of this throughout the first report and the second report. So this is why what I've done here for kind of this evaluation is I've actually made an Excel sheet where we mainly focus on the required numbers and the outcome of the test. And I've added a little bit of feedback, and I'll kind of go over that. But instead of looking at this report here, I want to look at an Excel sheet that I've put together. And I will also put a link to this. I'll have it posted on my website, so I'll put a link to this on my website if you want a link to the PDF of this Excel sheet so that you can go over the same numbers here. It's easier to read, in my opinion, than the sheet that they've put out. But again, if you're a Patriot One investor, I definitely recommend taking a look at that full report. I just think that this is a better way to kind of look at, did they meet those requirements? And I've also put test 1.1 and the test version 1.4 right next to each other so we can see kind of any improvement that they made in between those two tests, which again, to me, was the most impressive part out of this whole report. So how I have it laid out here is similar to they have it. We have the functional area on the left, we have the required percentage over here, and then we have the outcome of the test for version 1.1 and version 1.4, and I've put what I think are some important notes on the side here. So for handguns, again, in the first test, requirement was 98%. They only got 89% on the first test. But test version 1.4, which again was less than 1 month later, for only that amount of time, a few weeks, for them to make different improvements to the technology. 100% score, they received a 3, no feedback at all, they met the requirement. And on top of that, they actually tested some compact pistols as well, and the only one they had trouble with was a micro compact pistol, the Kimber 380 ACP Micro Raptor, and they even caught that 88% of the time. So that, to me, to go from not meeting the requirement, 89%, the main area that they had trouble with was the ankles, and then to go through just within a few weeks, fix that problem completely, test 100%, no comments necessary, that really speaks to their ability to take feedback from not only NCS4, but we've heard about, them talking to the leagues, making adjustments. This is just further example of their ability to take feedback, make the necessary changes to improve the product, and show the results here. So that one was really impressive to me. The next one here, knives 6 inches or more. We went over this just before when I gave you the example of why I thought the 0 to 3 scale was a little off. They scored 96% on 1.1. Again, though, improving to 100% on test 1.4. Knives 4 to 6 inches on test 1.1, 88% versus the 70% requirement. This one, though, we did get a little bit of an issue on test of the 1.4 version, right? And there was a note in a couple of the commentators' feedback that said there was one knife in particular that was not detected well. And in this particular test, there were only 2 total knives that were used as opposed to multiple knives from what it looks like in the first test. And so what that tells me is it's got to be something to do with that knife, maybe the composition of the metal, something like that, because in the first test, they did multiple knives, all of the locations, tested at 88%. To go from 88% down to 60% when they improved on gun detection, especially at the ankles, that to me tells me it's got to be something with that particular knife. That's why I put a couple asterisks next to that. And so to me that is a problem, right? Because obviously that means that there is a knife, or at least a type of knife that can get through their system very easily. Now, we know, basically no system catches ceramic knives at the moment or things like that, at least no metal detection system that is currently used by any of the major pro sports leagues, etc. But I'm putting an asterisk next to this one because I believe if there were more knives tested in the second test, let's say 10 knives, right? That one knife then would have only made up 10% of the overall tests, and they would have received a much higher percentage on the detection rate than if they just used those 2 knives like they did in the test there. So bad, but with a silver lining, right, is how I'm kind of looking at that one. The next one here, the requirement was less than 4 inches, or the category was less than 4 inches. There's actually no requirement that they gave for this one. And so they just wanted to test it, though, to kind of showcase what they can do, I guess. So 73% on test 1.1, and 77% on version 1.4. Again, improving there. And again, more evidence as far as why I believe it's kind of an anomaly with the 60% on the 4 to 6 knife range, because if you improve your detection on knives less than 4 inches, but somehow go down on knives bigger than that, it just doesn't really make sense there. So again, more evidence that I think we got kind of an anomaly there that's skewing that score to the downside. The next thing here is the innocuous items, right? And again, these ones we don't want to catch, right? We want people to be able to walk right through with these objects. We're talking keys, cell phones, wristwatch, belt buckle, coins, and then the last one there is kind of all of those different items combined, right? Somebody holding keys, wallet, phone, a lot of pretty much what people are going to be doing, right? Generally, people are at least going to have keys and a phone. Likely though, maybe a belt buckle, coins, a variety of things like that. So all of these were required at less than 10% detection. On most of these, they got 0, right? It performed perfectly, didn't detect any of it. The big problem here, what it looks like, is cell phones. And we also have the combined, but because the only thing that they detected out of all of these was cell phones, pretty much what's contributing to that combined score is the cell phones, right? The other things aren't necessarily what is detecting here, especially on this first one here, 8%, that is pretty much all the cell phone. And it seemed like from the notes that the main thing that was giving them problems were large cell phones. In particular, I think on the second test, was the iPhone 12 Pro Max, which is one of the largest cell phones out there from my understanding. This is a negative here because you still obviously want people with any size cell phone to be able to walk right through as long as they're not carrying any weapons. So this is something that it looks like Patriot 1 still has to work on. There wasn't a major improvement. In fact, it got even worse in the next test. Now, whether it actually got worse or whether they were just using a larger phone, which it seems the iPhone 12 Pro Max was in the second one, seems like it's not necessarily that it got worse. It just, is still remaining as a problem. We'll see if they come out with any news as far as them being able to fix that. To me, it seems like something that they should be able to fix. It's definitely a question that I would probably ask on the upcoming webinar in January. Do they have anything in the works to fix this? Is this an easy fix? Is this going to be more of a process? And things like that. But that being said, though, they did technically meet the requirement for all false alerts being less than 10% in total on each one. In the first metric here, so I have the general metrics, kind of the total metrics, total detection rate and total false alert rate. Basically, the standard we have here, total false alert rate must be less than 10%, and the total detection rate must be greater than 98% for kind of all of those objects combined. In the first one here, we have false alerts at 1.8%, so definitely meeting that standard there. In the detection rate, though, on the first test, they did miss. They got a 92%. Remember, the requirement is a 98%. Well, with those improvements, though, they got a 99% on the detection rate with version 1.4. So meeting that standard, in fact, exceeding it by a little bit. And even with the extra large cell phones, if you combine all of those categories, they did still technically score below a 10% detection rate on the false alert. So with the version 1.4 meeting the general metrics, the general standards for detection rates and false alerts there. The next thing here that was also tested, at least in the first report, was the user interface, and there's just a couple things that I want to touch on here. Let me raise it up so you guys can see this. And the first one here, I just want to go over some pros, some good things that the evaluators noticed. The system seemed, in most cases, to alert with image and video alerts and in the time necessary for them to kind of catch anybody that went through. There were some notes in there that were saying, when people were walking faster, it was hard for the system to alert fast enough for the person standing behind with the tablet to actually stop people and pull them aside for secondary screening. But it seemed like when people were walking at a normal pace, kind of spaced evenly, the system did pretty well with alerting in time for that person with the tablet to kind of divert any people who the system alerted to secondary screening. The alert history also was easily accessible, so that's nice for admin or any security supervisors if they need to go through anything. Live video view allowed for real-time monitoring, and the remote operation and monitoring of the system performed as advertised and met all requirements. Now, there were some cons here though. One of the big ones that several of the evaluators mentioned was that the red circle, which generally denotes where the object was detected on the person, was not always actually where the object was. The biggest one seemed to be, again, towards the head, where they mentioned that the object was above the level of the actual towers, right? The towers are probably about shoulder height or just below shoulder height for most people. And so if they have an object at the head, the circle didn't go that high, and so it wasn't actually alerting there. And I think they were saying, I could be wrong, but I think they were saying as well with the ankles, especially because it was having trouble there on that first test anyway. That being said though, with all of these cons that were mentioned with the user interface, the user interface wasn't actually part of the test categories in the second test. So we didn't actually get to see whether any of these, like the red circle or the lag that they experienced in some of the tests, we didn't actually get to see if any of those were also improved, because obviously we did see a significant amount of improvement in the detection. I'd be interested to know whether the user interface was also improved as well. And the last con there that I do want to mention here is that the system did not consistently alert fast enough when patrons were walking at fast paces, which I touched on earlier. Fast paces, kind of how they defined those, was about 1.5 meters per second. The average person walks, it seems, around 1.3 meters per second. I think it's probably even a little bit slower if you have ticketing right in front of this area where you're walking through the MSG platform, or you have, COVID tests. Generally, you have somebody kind of pacing you through there. So there's probably a little bit of a slowdown. You're probably looking on average walking through here at maybe more so 1 meter per second or 1.2, maybe around there. And again, with people walking at 1 meter per second, which they tested as well, and at a half a meter per second, I believe, on those ones, it seemed that the system was alerting with enough time, but it was just with the faster paces that they were kind of having trouble there. So again, I will put a link to this Excel spreadsheet so that you guys can take a look at it if you want to. I think, again, it organizes it just a little bit better so that you guys can see that. As far as though the actual scores, as far as the 0 to 3 scale that NCS4 uses, if we go back to the report, one last thing I want to show you guys. They did receive in both version 1.1 here a 2.5 out of 3, and in version 1.4 a 2.5 out of 3 overall for both of those exercises. So that's kind of what they gave them. Again, with the way that they kind of do that 2 and 3 on the scale, where as long as there's any feedback, it drops them down from a 3, I think it's a little bit skewed. So I think it's better just to look at the raw numbers. Where did they score in relation to those requirements? Did they meet those? And that's kind of the main thing. Again, the feedback is very useful, right? And it looks like it helped Patriot 1 to improve their product, and hopefully the feedback that they got in 1.4 test helps them improve it even further. And with that said, what are my overall thoughts on this report? Well, in general, I think this report was a good one. They met the standards, right? That's really what we're looking for here. And really what I think is going to help them accelerate their sales. I think there were probably a lot of customers that were kind of waiting to see what happened from this, especially since we saw from not only what NCS4 said in this report, but also the announcements, the newsletter that Peter put out recently. There were a lot of people in attendance from NHL, NBA, NFL, major pro sports leagues, global live entertainment companies that were watching this, and if they're wanting to attend, if they're actually there watching the report, they're probably interested in the results, which means Whether or not they actually go with the product is probably dependent on, okay, how does Patriot One actually perform in these tests? In my opinion, they perform pretty well, especially, again, what was most impressive to me was the improvement that they were able to make just in about 3 to 4 weeks' time. That to me, again, I know I've said this multiple times, but it really speaks to their ability to take in feedback and improve the product based on that feedback. And I think that's going to be something that really leads to a lot of success with a lot of these customers, because they're going to go to these customers, and if the customer says, hey, sorry, we need you to do this, this, and this, they're going to go, okay, we'll go do that. And they'll come back to that customer and say, hey, we did what you wanted. And I think that's going to be a great thing for them going forward. So that's kind of my general take on this report. Let me know in the comments below what you guys thought of the report, if you had any questions, anything like that. Other than that, I will see you guys next time, and have a great day.